Hello and welcome to Restitution, Returning Colonial Loot. I'm Lewis McNaught. In this episode, we're going to look at a group of sacred objects that can be returned right now, but the museum refuses to explain why they won't return them. They're called Tabots, sacred plaques from Ethiopia, and importantly, they can never be exhibited, photographed, copied, or even studied by anyone other than Ethiopian Orthodox priests. Now, as you know, the British Museum Act prevents the return of almost every object in the museum's collection, but there are some exemptions, legal exemptions, not loopholes. And one of those exemptions are for objects the trustees believe are unfit to be retained. Now, we believe, under any definition, these objects are unfit to be retained by the museum. As a consequence, we have, together with the leading human rights law firm Leigh, submitted 4 Freedom of Information requests to the museum, asking them to explain why they won't return the objects. But each of our requests has been stonewalled. So, how did the museum acquire them in the first place? Well, we know that 9 of the tablets in the British Museum were looted by a large British army sent out in 1868 to rescue a group of Europeans held hostage by the Abyssinian Emperor Tabots. After the emperor's army was overwhelmed, the emperor took his own life, and the soldiers then went out on a rampage of looting. Interestingly, a British Museum curator was on the expedition, one of the less glorious episodes in the history of the museum, according to David Wilson, one of the museum's former directors. Remember, if these objects are ever returned to Ethiopia, you and I are never going to miss them because you and I are never allowed to see them. And ironically, the only people who can decide their return, namely the museum's trustees, they're not allowed to see them either. That's why we've escalated our concern, together with Leigh, to the Information Commissioner's Office, to ask them to investigate why the British Museum are holding on to objects that have no place in a museum. My first guest might give us a clue. In 2019, Frezer Haile was part of a delegation from Ethiopia that met with the director of the British Museum. I want to know what he thinks lies behind the museum's failure to return the tabots. Well, Frezer, thanks for joining me today. Look, the thing that really concerns me about this group of objects is not the fact that they were looted, we know they were looted, but the fact that they don't belong in a museum. They don't belong in any museum. Can you explain why it's so important they're returned to Ethiopia and the Orthodox Church?
Yeah, thanks, Lewis. I think, the tabots are unique in every way. Firstly, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church is the only church, as far as my understanding, that actively uses copies or replicas of the Ark of the Covenant in day-to-day worship. And ultimately, these replicas are supposed to be housed in the churches in which they serve. The analogy I always use to try and bring this issue home to British audiences is similar to the mace in Parliament, right? It's the physical representation or embodiment of the monarch when they are not in Parliament. As long as the mace is there, it means that Parliament is sitting. And in much the same way, without the tabots in an Ethiopian Orthodox Church, it's as if God isn't present.
Now, you were present at a meeting that took place at the British Museum in 2019, where a delegation from Ethiopia, including the then Culture Minister, met with the then Director of the British Museum, Dr Frezer. What's happened since that meeting, and has there been any follow-up at all?
No, I think as with many things that were interrupted by the pandemic, this was one engagement that unfortunately fell foul of the lockdown and the various restrictions that were in place around engagements of this nature at the time. But in all honesty, I think there was a lack of will on the part of the museum and the management in particular to take the issue forward, because we had a subsequent meeting after the pandemic in which the ambassador and I and some of the members of the team engaged with Dr. Frezer at the museum to kind of restart the process, or not necessarily to restart, but to renew the process of returning the tabots and the discussions around other objects at the museum. The outcome of the meeting was particularly disappointing because it was almost like there was institutional amnesia that took place following the pandemic. And one of the first responses we got from the museum when we asked the question about whether the museum had made a decision or had discussed the tabots was the idea that we would need to restart the process of requesting. It was as if it was a brand new process. Like we were requesting the tabots to be returned anew. And we were like, no, this is renewing a request that was already well in motion, stemming from 2007, but even more recently in 2019. And they seemed quite surprised by that, which was disappointing.
Now, we've already referred in this podcast to the section in the British Museum Act, unfit to be retained. Was that ever referred to during the course of that meeting?
I think, yeah, in the 2019 meeting, although the legal concept wasn't raised explicitly, the custom that undermines it was, which is effectively the museum is not using these items in any sense of the word. They're not presenting them to the public in any way. Whereas the church has a need for the objects to go back and for them to be in their rightful places. And the culture minister made that point very eloquently to the management. But as always, it was, kick the can down the road and say, well, we'll take it back to the trustees and we'll return with their findings or views.
Now, interestingly, the British Museum have come up with an idea. They're proposing that they may be willing to loan their collection of tabots to the Ethiopian Orthodox Church in London. I wonder, Frezer, is that something which is a viable option, a viable solution?
I think it's absurd. It's absurd. I see very little scenario in which an institution such as the Orthodox Church, which has existed for over 1,500 years in Ethiopia, one of the world's oldest church institutions, would accept the notion that a museum would loan what is supposed to represent God to the church.
Now, one development that's really interesting is from Westminster Abbey. They appear to have announced that they are, in principle at least, willing to return their tabot, which is stored in the Lady Chapel. Now, do you think this could persuade the British Museum to think again? Do you think it could have some impact on their decision-making going forward?
I think it will help in that it will show what courage looks like when it comes to restituting objects of this importance. And it will set a precedent in one sense of a national level institution such as the Abbey doing this, because there have been other examples of tabots being returned from the UK, which were smaller in scale. The institutions weren't national. They were more, regional. But I do think that will be an important signal in the country of why these tabots shouldn't be in these institutions and they should go back to the churches they belong to.
Frezer, you're probably very familiar with one of the key objections that people continually use why we shouldn't return colonial loot, namely that the conditions where they are returned are unsuitable. They're probably safer in Western collections. Can I ask you, right now there is a schism in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. Will the tabots be safe if they are returned to Addis Ababa?
As always, there's no country, there's no institution in this world that hasn't gone through its schisms over time. And the tabot tradition in the Ethiopian church, predates any of these schisms, and has always come through in the same way that it has with other issues that the church has faced over the years. These items are extremely sacred. And they are almost above, as I said, they physically embody God, and God is above church schisms, I think.
So we have a new management team about to take control at the British Museum. I wonder, does this give you optimism for the future? Do you think there could be a change in direction regarding the tabots and indeed the museum's whole approach to restitution under the new director, Nicholas Cullinan?
Yes, I think I do. It's a cautious optimism because I feel like I've been optimistic for a few years and that hasn't really gotten us very far. But with the new management, and I think also just generally the state of the debate around the tabots in particular, I am hoping that the British Museum are able to look at these items for what they are, unique. Even within the restitution debate, they're unique in their own right. But unique culturally, unique spiritually, and very important to, an active and live church in another country, with obviously congregations and other churches represented here in the UK in terms of the communities that the British Museum should be speaking to. And I hope that the museum sees this as an opportunity to renew itself by making the right decision on this.
This lack of transparency by the museum is very concerning, which is why, together with the law firm Leigh, we asked the Information Commissioner's Office to investigate the museum's refusal to share the information. Now, with me today is Tom Short, Senior Associate at Leigh, who I hope is going to throw some light on the investigation. Recently, what we've been doing with the 4 Freedom of Information requests that we put to the museum, we've asked them essentially 2 quite simple questions. Firstly, have you discussed the future of the Tabots in the British Museum collection? And if so, what conclusion did you come to about their future management and retention? And we've met with absolute stonewall silence. What are the grounds that the museum are using to deny or to conceal the information?
Well, firstly, I'd say that that's quite right how you describe the museum's position, that they, as far as we're aware, haven't really made a public statement or produced a report about whether the tablets are unfit to be detained. So following the legal opinion that was published and sent to them, we haven't had an official response or a sort of rebuttal of that to say that they don't think it's correct, or they agree in part, or they agree but there's complications here or anything. So there is this mysterious process of decision making from the museum where they haven't yet revealed what their thinking is. Now, through the information requests we've made, we know that there was a board meeting in November 2022, and we know that restitution requests were discussed then. As you say, we put in information requests, we got back heavily redacted documents. We sought an internal review. We've had some back and forth with them across various requests, and we have slowly inched forward with getting more information, which in itself suggests that the museum perhaps doesn't provide all the information that it should have on the first request, and that they've sort of conceded some way, which is, really there should have been full transparency from the start. Where we're at now is that there are sections of a note produced in connection with a board meeting in November 2022, where it refers to the way forward on these restitution requests. And we understand that the information under that section, the entirety of the discussion and the proposal there that was put to the board, has been redacted. So we don't know what they were discussing about the way forward for the tablets and other items, let alone what options they were considering or what they finally decided. And then there's also a straightforward question that they haven't answered so far, which is whether they sought legal advice on this at all at any point. So following the publication of the opinion that says, well, actually, you can, under the Museums Act, return these items because they're unfit to be retained. You have the power to do that. We don't know if they have gone and sought their own legal advice on that. Now, given the importance of this matter, both of general public interest, but perhaps even more importantly, those people who want the tablets returned, so the Ethiopian Orthodox Church in particular, but also others who have an interest in ensuring restitution of objects like this, they're concealing from those people what process they've gone on, and it's surprising that they won't even say whether they've sought advice. But you would think, given the public interest, that they would have sought advice. We're not at this stage asking for the contents of that advice. So that brings me on to your specific question of what exemptions they're applying to stop publication. And so in the case of the legal advice, there's an exemption under the Freedom of Information Act under Section 42, which is about legal privilege. Now, normally, most of the case law on this is around someone trying to obtain a copy of the actual advice in whatever circumstance that is. So a public body's gone and it's got legal advice, and someone else is trying to get hold of a copy. So that will show you the substance of the advice, what the lawyers have actually said. That's fine in principle. Now, there may be exceptions where that shouldn't apply because of particular public interest or whatever it may be. But here what we're doing is just asking for confirmation at this stage of whether they have sought advice. And so we think that exemption isn't being properly applied here. We don't think there is a prejudice to the museum here, when common sense would dictate that they probably have got advice. So why can't they confirm it one way or another? Now, obviously, it would sort of be surprising and of interest if they hadn't gone and sought advice, but we can't see that there's a real prejudice to them. But in any event, you then move on to the second stage of the test, which is about the public interest. And we say here that there's sort of manifestly enormous public interest in ensuring transparency around the museum's decision-making process on cultural restitution and heritage issues, not least in circumstances where there's been wider questions about the museum's decision-making in recent years. Now, on the related request, which is concerning this this note by Hartford Fisher that was put to the board in 2022, in autumn 2022, they have also claimed an exemption to disclosure under Section 27, which concerns international relations. But fundamentally here, we've got the UK, an international state on the one side, but the main body calling for the return of the Tabots to Ethiopia is actually the Ethiopian Orthodox Church rather than the state. So it's a slightly odd application of the exemption in the first place. But even putting that to one side, if they get over the first hurdle of does it apply in the first place, there are yet again serious questions about what harm could possibly come from disclosing this information, and whether in any event the public interest says, well, we accept this potential prejudice, but the public interest is so great that it should be disclosed here. So we have this note from Hartford Fisher that sets out proposals for the way forward, and we're being denied all of the information there, what was put forward and subsequently what was decided. And this, 2 years ago now, and we don't know what they've been thinking. And it's perhaps worth saying that the default position really is that public authorities should publish information. The sort of the baseline position is to move towards disclosure. But in this case, that doesn't seem to be where the museum has wanted to go.
So we've had 4 failed attempts to extract that information from them, but now you've helped move this towards the Information Commissioner's Office. And by escalating it that way, are we more likely to get that information? And how can they intervene in this process that the museum continue to stick with to shield information?
Yeah, that's right. They have been failed attempts to get all of the information, but we have been successful, I suppose, as we go away, which is quite telling. I think that bit by bit we've chipped away at some of the information. So when we've gone back and sought an internal review, we've got a bit more, and so it raises questions about how they're treating these requests in the first place. We are, as you say, now at a point where we sought an internal review. The internal review, carried out by another information officer in the museum, upheld the original decision to refuse to disclose this information. It did so on the same reasons as in the original decision. There's nothing new, no sort of detailed consideration, and in fact no reaction to the argument we had made. It just upholds the original decision. So at that point we decided with you to file a complaint to the Information Commissioner's Office. We only have limited information about how the museum's handling requests, but I think it is a fair characterization to say that they seem to be operating from a baseline position that they shall refuse requests on these topics rather than treating them with an open mind. Now, I wouldn't want to go too far on that. I'm sure there's fair handling and so on, but certainly we have seen a sort of quite zealous approach approach to applying exemptions, which from my experience of making many information requests seems to sort of err towards preventing disclosure compared with some other public authority. So there may be good reasons for that, of course. We just can't see the underlying information because it comes to us redacted. So having a third party in there to look, the Information Commissioner's Office, is hopefully going to be helpful.
And I suppose the question is, if the ICO decide that they should release the information, can they compel the museum to release that information? Do they have sufficient force to be able to do that?
Yes, they do. So they can make a decision and then the museum should comply with it. There's an appeals process from that. We could end up in the information tribunal. But fundamentally, I mean, it's not a sort of lightweight mediation process. It's the Information Commissioner has the power to make a decision that has to be abided by.
All of that means we're just going to have to await the decision by the ICO. In the meantime, that's it. See you in the next episode.